once again is going to sing for us a song. I imagine it's going to be a labor song. Just thinking it might be.
Some gangster rap.
Turns out that's all I have left. Okay. We're going to try this. Maybe get it right. I am my father's son. I knew where it was headed before it had begun. For every one of us will one day have a choice. So as they raise the heat, commotions spilling over out into the street, closed my eyes and I could hear my father's voice. Now listen close, he said, for what I have to give you's like a golden thread that you should weave into the fabric of your life. Don't turn away and hide. Stand up for what you know to be the proper side. And in this manner, you can hold your head up high. When you fight for what is right, you could win or you might merely stumble and fall. There's only one way forward when your back's against the wall. Then he turned to me and showed me an old scar while his eyes rested in reverie. That was the time the goons attacked us at the plant. Won the strike that day, another week's vacation and a raise in pay. Go make your mark, let no one tell you that you can. When you fight for what is right, you could win or you might merely stumble and fall. One way forward when your back's against the wall. When you fight for what is right, you could win or you might merely stumble and fall. But there's only one way forward when your back's against the wall.
Welcome back again, sisters and brothers, comrades and friends. The topic tonight in our last session is raise wages, defend jobs, fight for justice. And first of all, before I get to our speakers, I have to bring regrets from Chris Goss, brother of and he's president of the International Longshoremen Union, local in St. John's, Newfoundland. With regrets for personal reasons, he couldn't be here tonight. So we will move forward with our speakers. Our first speaker will be Sister Christine Murray from Socialist Action USA. Our second speaker will be Brother Mike Palecek, National President of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and even though I'm retired from it, still think it's the best union in North America. Our third speaker is Pam Frache from Provincial Coordinator of $15 and Fairness Campaign. Our fourth speaker is Brother Reverend Comrade Julius Arscott, OPSEU, Ontario Public Service Union, Socialist Action Canada. Christine.
Fight for wages and jobs with dignity has taken a dramatic turn. Sorry.
And you have up to 15 minutes.
Sure. The fight for jobs and wages and jobs at dignity has taken a dramatic turn for the good in the United States. The major manifestation of that, of course, is the upsurge of teachers that swept West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Colorado. In these states, we have observed new phenomena. After decades of the defunding of public education and 40 years of devastating concession contracts implemented by union misleaderships, the ranks burst forth and took control of their struggle, winning unexpected victories and signaling a possible sea change in the class struggle in the United States. Since at least the mid-1970s, when the bosses decided to decisively jettison the post-World War II social contract, U.S. workers have been hamstrung by a leadership that refused to seriously fight this offensive. And for at least as long, socialists in the U.S. have been saying that given the ever-declining standard of living and the increasing contradictions of working-class life in the United States, workers would find a way out of this cul-de-sac of their ossified and undemocratic union structures. We patiently insisted that workers still had the power and it could be unleashed to better their conditions. We patiently argued for a social unionism that would link the power of organized labor with the broad social movements and battle for a social wage, that is healthcare, education, housing, and pensions, all kinds of social provisioning that could unify the fights of women, children, and the elderly, the oppressed nationalities, and those without papers. We cheered modest victories of workers' centers and other extra-union modes of organizing the class for battle. But we could not know exactly how workers would finally find their power and organize themselves out of the straitjacket that had been placed on them in the past decades. Now we know what the first phase might look like. And we're experiencing this on the macro level of the teachers' upsurge in the red states, and in micro situations outside of the 5-state upsurge. We're observing the earliest manifestation of the kinds of democracy the ranks will create on the road to building a fighting labor movement and a reinvigorated class struggle. I'd like to start with the micro. In Connecticut, where I'm from, socialists have been part of an amazing project to organize the hotels in Stamford, Connecticut. I want to show you an article from the Labor and Working Class History Association website about hospitality workers, Local 217. The title is, "Stamford Workers Show How to Transform Our Unions and Rebuild the Labor Movement." In Stamford, there's been a happy confluence of the dire objective circumstances experienced by low-wage workers in the service industry and a subjective quirk. An organizing director committed to rank-and-file unionism and a workforce of immigrants, mostly with papers, or for the moment, temporary protected status, from Haiti, Honduras, Colombia, and other far-flung places have come together to create and document a new way forward. To organize the Stamford hotels, they first codified a way of functioning that put power in the hands of the ranks on a daily basis in one organized hotel. Instead of relying on a many-step grievance procedure that puts staff or lawyers in a room with the company far away in time and space, they began to deal with all grievances on the shop floor, so to speak, organizing direct actions by the workforce, going to the boss, demanding redress on the spot. The union became a living, breathing organization with a militant presence day in and day out on the shop floor. Over time, 20 of the workers who'd experienced that new union life formed a committee to organize the other hotels in the city. They met weekly and divided up the work of home visits to unorganized workers, potential members in one of the unorganized hotels. Haitian workers who knew the Haitian community took charge of that outreach. Colombians who knew the Colombian community did the same, and so on. When there was a core of new workers judged trustworthy, an organizing committee for the hotel became involved in their own house visits. A housekeeper that I know at the Hilton explained they went over and over and over again to the homes of those to be organized, as long as it took to quell their fears and win their full support. The campaign to organize the Hilton in Stamford was truly run by the ranks. Weekly steward meetings, there's only one staff person in this local, the weekly steward meetings were run by vote with the agendas developed by the stewards themselves. In an interview, one of the stewards described the process this way: we voted on the weekly agenda, then we voted on all the issues on the agenda, every single item before moving on. Some votes felt silly at the time if the issues were small or so obvious, but if someone put it on the agenda, we figured it was not silly to someone, and every single item, everyone's opinion in the union is important. From what type of shop action to organize about a grievance, to what type of t-shirts to buy, the rank and file members were handed the reins over it all. And this membership, convinced that this organization was really theirs, had great power when trying to win new members. Their control over their own organization was so obvious to the new recruits that it was a rebuff to company claims that the union was just another business trying to get their money. At the Hilton, despite millions of company dollars spent on anti-union campaigns and threats, replacement workers lined up around the block on the day before the vote. The union workers voted 110-5 to join the union. With their new place, in the rank and file run organization, they decided to give a try to aspects of social unionism too. They voted to send a representative to the launch of the March 8th International Women's Strike in New York City. And the housekeeper that they sent, after meeting low-wage women workers from around the country, came home to lead her local in a vote to join the global strike on March 8th, 2018, in defense of women's rights and the rights of working people. This one-hour action to strengthen their local battle by expressing solidarity with the millions of women marching around the world speaks volumes about what a little union democracy might mean in the future. I gotta get a drink. What's happening at the Hilton in Stamford has unfolded in the most dramatic way. In a much larger scenario, the 5-state teacher upsurge of this spring. In West Virginia, where the upsurge kicked off, teachers sick of the inaction of their leaderships during decades of cuts to public education that had slashed their income and left the most needy and vulnerable students in the lurch, organized themselves within and without of union spaces to finally say no. They used social media to unite the struggles of the 55 counties of West Virginia, to discuss and politically arm themselves, and to share stories of intensive organizing school by school by school. Now, teachers have been organizing a long time in West Virginia to try to stop the devastation of public education and the gutting of a health care fund that takes care of them and the rest of the public workers in the state. But the events of the last 2 years, the deepening of cuts, the upset of the Trump election, the failure of the Democrats to take advantage of the outrage, basically put them in a new place. And it pushed them to reinvent the methods of deploying their class power. One of the straws that broke the camel's back was the decision of the crummy health insurance provider to give rate discounts to public workers who would wear a Fitbit on their wrists that would transmit their steps, weight, and gym workouts, or not, to the provider. It was the final indignity to workers, 75% of whom are female, many of whom are forced to work 2 or 3 jobs to sustain their families while caring for their own children and elderly and disabled family members. The call for a strike illegal for teachers in most states, but illegal with a history, with vengeance, really, in this newly right-to-work state, with the bosses feeling their power. It began in the southern counties, the old center of some of the most extraordinary labor risings in U.S. history. Teacher families spoke to reporters about their heritage, their responsibility to build a working class fight back. That language came because they were the children and the grandchildren and whatever of the, in these first counties were the counties where they would remind, I'm sorry, a little confused there, remind reporters of the Battle of Blair Mountain, where in 1921, 10,000 armed miners fought company paramilitaries and eventually the U.S. Army in order to organize the southwestern coalfields. Others spoke of the takeover in 2011 of the Wisconsin State House by labor. If you remember, that was at the moment of the Arab Spring, and there was people showed up in the State House acknowledging that coincidence. And they said the big mistake in Wisconsin was listening to the unionist leaders who sent people home without a victory, and of a massive student strike in 1990 that provided a vision of what could go wrong. Left to their own means of debate and deliberation and mass decision-making in giant online forums, the teachers decided to demand that money for education and health care be pooled by taxing the fossil fuel giants, now gas companies, that have raped West Virginia for 150 years. Left to their own means of debate and deliberation, they just said no when the state union officials from both the AFT and the NEA collaborated on a deal with the legislature that fell short of their demands. Left to their own means of debate and deliberation, they refused to leave anyone in the lurch, and out of their struggle won not only their own 20% increase, but across the board increase for all state workers in the middle of the deepest cutbacks. And left to their own devices, they forged the ties with parents and communities that allowed them to see that children out of class were fed and nurtured in the midst of this chaos.
3 minutes.
In the risings that followed in other states, the details of which are too complicated and specific to share in this kind of forum, unorganized teachers joined into the process wholeheartedly. In right-to-work Oklahoma, where cutbacks had led to 4-day weeks in 20% of the school districts, less than a third of the teachers were even members of the Oklahoma Teachers Union. Yet, more than two-thirds of the schools were shut down. Non-union teachers organized their own forums and joined into the strike. In the end, Oklahoma teachers were undercut in the old way. With support withdrawn at a critical moment, but their experience, it's impossible to erase. The ideas, the new possibilities of struggle that are now clearly laid out for all, organized and unorganized. To learn the ins and outs of each state's struggle, one needs to follow the labor and socialist press, and none achieved quite the brilliant outcome of the West Virginia strikes. But we can make some generalizations. In the face of intolerable attacks on their jobs, their mission, their vocation, and their families, their most vulnerable neighbors, rank-and-file teachers found a way around the roadblocks that had seemed insurmountable in the past. They grounded themselves in the most profound democracy, basing the struggle on a combination of person-to-person local organizing and massive open democratic discussions of the ranks online, including the unorganized. When freed of the narrow and limited thinking about options and allies, they jettisoned their complete reliance on the Democratic Party, and they figured out how to engage and finally mobilize their own power on a statewide basis. In some instances, teachers explained their new strength came from recognizing the power of school staff. That is, teachers realized that cafeteria workers and bus drivers that their withdrawal of labor would actually shut down a school that 50% of the teachers walking out of would not. They spoke of their need, they learned lessons from this. They spoke of their need to be the voice of the whole working class, to take on the fight for social services for all. They taught, in the words of this slogan has a long history, that the only illegal strike is an unsuccessful strike, and that nothing can stop them if they've truly engaged and inspired the majority. And of course, that union democracy and the involvement of the unorganized is a critical element in the creation of a fighting new labor movement. Of course, this poses giant challenges for socialists. The stakes have been raised. It's undeniable that in big sections of North America now, the ranks are looking for new ways to go successfully into battle. Some forces on the left see this in terms narrower than necessary. They see institutionalized caucuses that will fight for power in each individual organization as the obvious next step. They underplay the degree to which a space has been created to explore the bigger questions of social unionism and independent political action, and just how timely and critical it is that they consciously forge a class struggle left wing within the labor movement. Socialist action understands that this will have a national and international basis, and that the combative ranks of the Stanford Hilton and the women of Mingo County have things to say to each other, and they would like to say them now. And that the gendered and racialized experiences of all these workers are going to lead to new spaces of political discussion and organization to advance class struggle perspectives. And that the question of class independence will have to be fought out in many arenas of the emerging class struggle. If you want to be part of thinking out how to meet this challenge, you need to be in a revolutionary organization whose whole reason for being is to experience the class struggle in all its richness, to consider the way forward in a process that involves newly radicalized ranks and the theory that has been codified from generations of working class victories and defeats, and organize in a way serious enough to bring all this effectively into working class spaces. And I believe I will end there.
Okay, Brother Mike.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Palecek. I'm the National President of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And let me start by saying what a privilege it is to be here and to be in a room full of committed activists. You know, my day-to-day life now is meeting with politicians and labor leaders and senior civil servants and managers and lawyers and media and journalists, and God, it's good to be in a room full of revolutionaries. So, to understand where things are headed right now with the struggle at Canada Post, I have to go back a few years, back to December of 2014, when Stephen Harper's government announced, 2013, December 2013, when Stephen Harper's government very sneakily announced the day after Parliament had broke for Christmas that they were going to end door-to-door delivery and basically roll out a plan to more or less destroy the entire public service that we do. It wasn't just about the community mailboxes, but also a massive attack on pensions, an attack on working conditions after, frankly, decades of austerity had already hit postal workers. Round after round, we've been facing cuts and attacks from government after government, whether they be liberal or conservative. This was the lead up to this moment. And so we knew right then and there that we were in big trouble. We had a huge fight on our hands, and we were just coming off of a major defeat where we took a number of rollbacks out under the Conservatives' legislation, or the Back to Work legislation, where they took away our right to free collective bargaining. That legislation now has been declared unconstitutional, by the way, and repealed. We knew that at the time too. This is the thing with Back to Work legislation. It's always unconstitutional when they bring it in, and they always know that when they bring it in. They always know that it's going to be repealed by the courts a few years later too, when everything's over and done. But you never get back what they stole from you with that legislation. We've seen this before. So this is what brought us to this point, where they then roll out this massive attack on postal services and postal workers. And so we knew that we had to launch a campaign to save Canada Post, that we had to connect with our communities and our allies and mobilize the country to defend this service. And at the same time, I have to be honest, it was a daunting task. Everybody said it couldn't be done. Even our allies, even a lot of our own members, our own activists, said it's done. It's been announced. They're rolling it out. You can't stop it now. So we heard that everywhere we went, but we never listened to it. We always were determined to stop this, and so that brought us to we had a whole year of campaigning where we organized town hall meetings in communities all over the place. We held demonstrations. We picketed Stephen Harper everywhere he made a public appearance since the day that announcement was made until the election where he was defeated. And I'll tell you this, here's something for international solidarity. I was marching with the Palestinians today, but when Stephen Harper went to the West Bank, he was met by a picket line of Palestinian postal workers holding Save Canada Post. So we had this huge fight on our hands, and we reached out to our allies and our communities in ways that we hadn't in a long time. We organized public meetings. There were other groups that set up citizens organizations. Londoners for Door to Door, of course, was one out in London. But these sorts of things happened organically all over the place. Labor councils jumped on board and helped play a role at the grassroots level. We organized mass canvassing in neighborhoods. We'd go out and knock on doors and talk to people. And I tell you, I've been involved in politics for a while, and I've knocked on a lot of doors. It was the easiest door knocking I've ever done. Every door you went to, everyone already agreed with you. And they said, what can we do? What do I sign? Who should I call? So we were able to mobilize people that way. And then when it came to the election campaign, we knew we had to defeat Stephen Harper. We knew that if the Conservatives got in, they would have utterly destroyed the post office. And make no mistake about it, that was their agenda from the beginning, was to break it up and sell it off to their friends on Bay Street. So we had to stop that from happening. Now officially, my union is nonpartisan. We don't endorse political parties. And I know in this room that's another topic to itself. So I'll leave that for the bar tonight. But we took the approach of saying that we were going to work to defeat Conservatives everywhere. And we didn't endorse anyone. Even though we managed to get a postal worker elected to Parliament for the first time. But even Sister Corinne Trudell, we didn't endorse her. But we worked on the issues, like our union always does. So we issued a report card, for example, explaining the positions of every party in relation to the post office to make things clear. We organized town hall meetings, all candidates meetings, where any political party could come and explain their position. So we did things like this, and we allow the public to draw their own conclusions. And frankly, they did. But when it came to the election campaign, we started with our campaign coordinators who had been working for years by this point on the whole Save Canada Post campaign. And they went through the old election results poll by poll in order to lay those results onto the new election map, so we can get a view of what that election would look like with the new boundaries. And by doing that, we were able to identify the weakest Conservative seats all over the country. And then we took a list of 120 communities that were scheduled to lose their door-to-door delivery, either on shortly after or shortly before the election. And we laid that onto the map. And so that gave us a map of all of the places we could have the biggest impact on our issues in Tory swing seats to defeat these Conservatives. So we bought an RV, a big 30-some-odd foot mobile home, and we had a big wrap put on it so that it was all deckled out with slogans that Save Canada Post, Stop the Cuts, Stop Harper, and we drove that thing from St. John's, Newfoundland, all the way to Victoria, British Columbia, and back again, zigzagging in between, and we drove into every Tory swing seat in the country to bring those assholes down one at a time. And we got into a rhythm. Every morning, we'd get up at about 5 a.m. We'd get to the work floor for 6 a.m. or 7, depending on where we were, talk to the letter carriers or the workers in the plants before they go out for their day, right? So we would hold a work floor talk. We'd usually take over the shop or bring everybody into the lunchroom, something like that, and talk about the election, talk about the importance of defeating the Conservatives, getting people to sign up onto the campaign, getting people engaged so everyone knew what we were doing. And from there we would go try to get to a local radio station for 9 a.m., 8 a.m. when rush hour traffic is at its peak, wherever you are, so you get the biggest impact. We do talk radios, and then we'd meet with local stakeholders during the day, whether it be city councilors, mayors, seniors organizations, anybody really that was willing to talk to us in a community. And then in the evening we'd do a town hall meeting, an all candidates meeting, where all of the candidates were invited to come and talk about postal issues. The Conservatives did not show up for one single meeting. It's not a big surprise. The other parties all got to argue it out for their positions. So all of that together, and with the mobilization of thousands of postal workers across the country, and that's the big thing that really did this, was the grassroots effort to get out into the neighborhood, knock on doors, talk to the allies, talk to communities. That's what moved this. So we were able to defeat the Harper government, not just us, obviously that was a big effort, but cuts at Canada Post pulled as one of the top 5 ballot box issues in this country. We turned it into a massive election issue, and it did play a role in defeating Stephen Harper. More importantly, it also moved all of the other political parties. At the beginning of the campaign, the Liberals were really wishy-washy on what they were going to do. Then they said, well, we'll stop the cuts, but we won't undo any of it. And then by the time we got to the election campaign, the Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, was already promising to restore it entirely. Of course, that's not what they've done.
Surprise, surprise.
We did manage to stop the cuts, and in doing so, we saved door-to-door delivery for about 4.5 million people, and we saved about 6,500 jobs across the country, living wage jobs in every community. And now we're back at the bargaining table. We went immediately, basically, from the election campaign to the bargaining table, where we ended up. Things came to a head over the summer of 2016. You probably saw we were at basically a stalemate over the summer for a period of a few months, and we ended up agreeing to 2 status quo collective agreements, short term, basically to give us a little more room to get into a position where we could actually win and start making some gains. So we had stopped the bleeding, we had stopped the concessions, but we hadn't been able to achieve the things that we need to achieve. And so now now we're back at the bargaining table again. That collective agreement's expired. We're actually well into bargaining. And we placed, well, a lot of important demands for our members on the table. We faced a lot of cuts in the Harper era that need to be undone. We are placing door-to-door delivery on the bargaining table. We're demanding that they restore door-to-door delivery to every house they cut it from, like they promised they would do. We need a decent wage increase, that's for sure. And they need to fix the pay scale. They need to undo the massive cuts to all of the new hires that they brought in. They dropped their wages down to 19 bucks an hour, which you can barely live on in most cities now. So we have a lot of these bread and butter issues that need to be fixed this round, and believe me, we're ready to fight for them if we have to. But at the same time, there are some important issues for the public that we're putting on the bargaining table. We've also been campaigning for some time for postal banking.
Yeah.
And we rolled this campaign out right about the same time as they were rolling out their cuts. Because we refused to accept the frame they were trying to put on us, that there had to be cuts, that there was nothing that could be done. We said, no, actually, we can expand services and we can build new services that people need in this country. And we can do it in a way that actually brings in revenue and is sustainable, right? We can see this. This isn't rocket science. Postal banking is a success all over the world. And what that is, for folks who don't know, it's basically a public bank operated through the post office. This is the norm in most countries. It's not the norm here. That's why we pay some of the highest bank fees in the world in this country. Because the big banks have us by the throat.
Yes.
There are 6 big banks in this country that dominate our economy, that leech $40 billion a year out of working class people with all kinds of fees and interest rates and everything else.
Shame.
We have an opportunity to stop this. We can build a public option. We can build a public bank. But we know that they're not just going to give this to us. And believe me, the big banks are already involved. They're at Treasury Board twice a week, and they're saying, don't you dare. Don't you dare give them a bank. We know what's going on here. The big banks are weighed in. So we're putting postal banking on the bargaining table because we know that people across this country need access to decent financial services without getting nickeled and dimed every time they want to take out a 20. And at the same time, the big banks are abandoning rural Canada. They're closing up shop. They don't want to spend the money to keep the counters open. Well, you know what? There are 6,000 post offices across this country. We're keeping those counters open, and we'll be happy to provide banking services at them. And there's another big thing that we're putting on the table. Because, I don't know, maybe we didn't have enough on our plate already. But there's an elephant in the room in all of this. And it's called climate change. And this is serious. It can't be glossed over. The reality is we need to completely restructure our society in a way that it is sustainable, and if we don't do that, we're likely going to die. It is really that simple. So we have to do this. And so we're putting climate change on the bargaining table.
Wow, great.
We're demanding that Canada Post, which has the biggest vehicle fleet in the country, immediately begin transitioning to electric vehicles. We're calling on Canada Post to put electric charging stations at post offices in every small town in this country so that our highways are electrified and people can actually buy electric vehicles. We're demanding that the government make funds available to retool auto plants and put some laid-off auto workers back to work building electric vehicles to lead this green shift. Canada Post is the biggest piece of federal infrastructure. It's the biggest retail network in the country. It's the biggest logistics network in the country. has the biggest vehicle fleet in the country, and it's owned by the federal government. Trudeau has all kinds of big things to say about climate change. He hasn't done much, but he has lots of things to say about it. Well, you know what? If you're serious about a just transition, if you're serious about actually meeting these targets, you can start with your own responsibility under the federal government, the biggest piece of infrastructure that you have, and use Canada Post, use our crown corporations to lead this transition, to make these changes throughout the economy. We can do it. We know they won't do it unless we force them to, so it's on the bargaining table. And I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, now was I bragging when I said it was the best union in North America? Okay, Sister Pam.
Thanks very much. Well, maybe just start by giving me a show of hands of who here is from outside Ontario. Okay, so there's a few of you who may not know this, the story of what we've won with the Fight for 15 in fairness. So let me just start. Actually, before I start, I'm going to pass these out. If I can get you to take one and then pass it out behind you. And the reason I'm passing it out is because I'm going to encourage everyone to actually open up the brochure, because you can sort of follow along. This is a very nice summary of what we've been able to accomplish. And Labor Notes in the U.S. basically described our campaign as so far the most comprehensive fight in the low-wage workers movement in North America to date, and probably the biggest reforms in 3 decades. So this is what is at stake in the election in Ontario. The most high-profile piece of this reform is obviously the question of the $15 minimum wage, and people will, in Ontario, will know that the minimum wage increased to $14 on January 1st, and it's scheduled to increase to $15 in 2019. But of course, standing between $14 and $15 an hour is the June 7th election. And I'm sure you all probably know that Doug Ford, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, has basically put that, it was almost the first promise. They have very few promises. They don't even have a platform document. But it was one of the first promises that he made was to scrap the $15 minimum wage. And in order to sweeten the offer, because we know even 40% of Conservative supporters support a $15 minimum wage for workers, he's claiming that he'll eliminate taxes for minimum wage earners. Well, of course, we know that thanks to existing tax credits and deductions, 2/3 of workers who earn less than $30,000 a year already pay no provincial taxes. So he's asking those workers to forego their wage increase in exchange for fake tax cuts. On the one hand, and even for those who do pay taxes, it's a bad deal, because the average tax rebate, according to the Conservatives' own figures, will be about $800, but they'll lose $1,900 in increased wages in their after-tax wages if they forego the $15 minimum wage. And we need to know that when we raise the minimum wage, we're essentially taking billions of dollars out of corporate profits. Our estimates are about $5 billion each and every year are taken directly from corporate profits and placed into the pockets of workers. So we also know that when that is where the rubber hits the road for class struggle. And that is why the backlash against even the Liberal government has been so ferocious. Hell hath no fury like a portion of the 1% scorn, and they are mad as hell. But it goes beyond that, and I want to talk about a couple of other pieces that we won. And this is the piece on equal pay. Because this is equal pay for full-time, part-time, casual, temporary, and whether or not you're a temporary agency worker. So what it basically means, take a plant, for example, I know a brother in SEIU was telling me, from Hamilton, was telling me, and I may not have the exact wage rates exactly right, but it was something in the neighborhood of full-time workers making around $35 an hour, part-time workers making around $27 an hour, and casuals making around $18 an hour. And yet they all do the exact same job on the same lines. And that's not because they were a bad union or anything, because that's just typical in the industry to have differential wages depending on the nature of your hiring contract. Well, according to the legislation that we won by insisting on equal pay for equal work, for non-union workers, as of April 1st, you have to be paid the same, and the legislation explicitly states that the wages have to come up to achieve that equality. And for unionized workers, if your contract hasn't expired before January 2020, then your contract has to be in compliance. But if you're bargaining a new contract after April 1st, then your new contract has to be compliant with the new laws. So this is particularly significant for OPSEU, where they have part-time support staff in the college sector. Tens of thousands of workers have joined a union and will be bargaining their first contract, potentially under equal pay law, which means in some cases the difference between $18 an hour and $35 an hour for these college workers. But it also applies to college faculty as well, where there's actually 3 categories. There's unionized part-time and non-unionized part-time and unionized full-time. It's a disaster. But this legislation, and actually because not everyone has had their union recognized yet, even though the votes have been done but the ballots haven't been counted, they are still now technically covered under the Ministry of Labor, under the Employment Standards Act, which means as of April 1st, they should be getting equal pay with their full-time counterparts. So literally, I would submit to you, sisters and brothers, that in the year ahead, that is going to be a key battleground, whether or not college workers are able to win equal pay, because we know that workers of color are overrepresented in part-time employment. Why? Because of racism in the labor market. Let's just be plain and simple about it. Newcomers, similarly. Indigenous people, similarly. Why? Because people of course want full-time jobs, but because they're not offered them, people of color are overrepresented in part-time employment. But also it's a question around gender equity as well, because women, thanks to having the bulk of caregiving responsibilities in the home, are often compelled to choose part-time work over full-time so they can manage work and their family caring responsibilities. Equal pay will significantly help close the equity and gender pay gap in this province. It's a massive accomplishment. But even taking it one step further, I want to touch on what it means for temp agencies. Because I'm sure all of you know the way temp agencies operate is that they basically an employer says, look, I pay my guys $20 an hour, so I'm going to give you the equivalent of $20 an hour. You give me the guys, and I wash my hands of the headache of having to manage those folks. So the temp agency says, thank you very much, I'll take your $20 an hour, I'll pay the workers minimum wage, and I will pocket the difference. Well, up until January 1st, 2018, that minimum wage was $11.60. So a temp agency could be pocketing over $12 an hour basically off the backs of workers who are in vulnerable situations. Of course, now it's $14 an hour because we've accomplished that in January, so $6 gets pocketed. The profit comes out of the pockets of workers, not off the client company. Now that temp agency workers need to be paid the same as directly hired workers, it forces the temp agency, if they want to make a profit, they have to charge the profit to the client company. That is a massive disincentive for companies to avail themselves of temp agencies. And we talked about this the other day. There's a massive amount of temp agencies that are used even in the public service and in the public sector. This is not just a private sector issue. The other thing we were able to accomplish, and this comes out of our previous $14 minimum wage campaign, where we also won a provision in legislation for joint and several liability. And that means the client company and the temp agency are jointly responsible for health and safety on the job. Why does that matter? How many of you read the Toronto Star expose by Sarah Mojtahedzada going undercover at Fiera Foods as a temp agency workers? Some of you read that? Basically, it's a situation where temp agency workers are brought in to these factory conditions with no training. They're given the most dangerous work. It is appalling. Most of them don't even get paid by check with a proper notation of deductions. They have to go to a Money Mart to collect wads of envelopes, their money in envelopes. It's appalling. And a year ago, there was a death of a young woman, Amina Diaby, who's had no training on the machines, and her hijab got caught in the machinery and she was killed. That was the third death at Fiera Foods of temp agency workers in 10 years. In 10 years. And yet, Fiera Foods had a clean bill of health from WSIB. Why is that? Because the employment of record in a temp agency is the temp agency, not the place where those workers are working. So Fiera Foods could kill 3 workers and God knows how many other workplace accidents and pay no additional premiums for their WSIB and have no legal liability for those workers. And so that's another reason that temp agencies are in business, sisters and brothers, because of that reality. Well, the legislation that we put in place back in just shortly in 2014 was finally enacted in mid-April. So now temp agencies and client companies are jointly responsible. And what that has basically meant are two major financial incentives for the use of temp agency workers. It's a body blow against the temporary employment industry. And to give you an example of what that means, thanks very much, what that means for unionized workplaces, there's a warehouse in Brampton, for example, that is organized with the union that has availed themselves of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of temp agency workers. Well, the employer notified the union to say, thanks to Bill 148, we are now going to hire directly 700 workers who are now for the first time going to be part of a union with proper benefits, with decent representation and real job security for the first time. That's a victory for the working class, sisters and brothers. And we can hear some meetings all over the place. That's just one warehouse. We're hearing similar stories all over the province of warehouse workers suddenly being hired directly. But of course, all of this is a grave, grave danger, because it's not all good news. People will probably have heard that the Liberals just caved to the corporate lobby on the issue of equal holiday pay. It was the first time that a part-time worker could get the same paid day as a full-time worker. And the difference could be, let's say two workers earn $20 an hour. A part-time worker could get, a full-time worker might get $140 for a holiday pay, and a part-time worker might get as little as $14 an hour. That's how massive the inequity is around holiday pay. So this had been corrected, and just on last Monday, the Liberal government caved to the corporate lobby and basically said it's reverting back to the old formula. And that is, it's a terrible blow for us. But the worst part about it is that when we lose these, if we lose these gains, it's not just the kind of reverting to the status quo. It actually has the effect of bolstering the ruling class. And I want to just quickly read to you what the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses had to say in response to this capitulation by the Liberal government. She says, the CFIB's Director of Provincial Affairs for Ontario says the reversal signals the government is willing to reconsider parts of its legislation already passed. That could include the next change around scheduling of workers, including on-call staff, which is set to kick in on January 1st, 2019. Quote, this is an opportunity to look at a full review of all those provisions as well, she says. If someone out there is looking at Bill 148 and says that's been passed and thinking the job is done, there's nothing we can do about it, well, this is an example that this shows that it is possible. So you can bet your bottom dollar that they are licking their chops about a potential Ford victory on June 7th, and it's really important that we get out there and spread the word about what's at stake, because most workers don't know what we've accomplished. The fair scheduling that she's talking about is actually one of many things. You can read about it in the brochure, but it's a situation where, for the first time ever, there's a financial penalty against an employer who keeps a worker on call all day long and never calls them in. Now a worker has to be paid at least 3 hours, even if they're not called into work. This is finally going to put a little bit of a break on employers who play fast and loose with our time. Of course, it goes without saying we are the first jurisdiction in Canada to achieve 2 paid emergency leave days. That's like paid sick days for the first time in Canadian jurisdiction, and that's available to workers after 7 days on the job. And starting on their first day on the job, every worker has access to 10 unpaid job-protected emergency leave. And what that means is, because it used to be the case that small workplaces were excluded from their access to job protection in the event of emergency. So of course women, people of color are overrepresented in smaller workplaces. Now for the first time, a person won't be fired if they have to go pick their kid up from the hospital or from school or something to that effect. So these are major changes. We won these, we didn't have a multi-million-dollar budget. We had to basically go out and energize and build the confidence of workers in low-income jobs. And that's why when the campaign first launched, when it first came out with $14 an hour, these demands were not demands that were dreamt up by a really smart economist that did all the calculations. These were not demands dreamt up by radicals. The demands of the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign were established by low-income workers themselves. And why does that matter? Because we can have all the highfalutin demands that we want, but if workers themselves don't believe it's possible to fight and win them, then they are not going to prioritize organizing and fighting for these demands. And so it is true, when the campaign first launched, workers chose $14 an hour, not 18, not 20, not 22, not 25, and surely, of course, people would want those that as a minimum wage. They chose 14 because they thought we could do it. And that means that makes their time spent fighting worthwhile. And what's so incredible about the $14 minimum wage campaign is that we didn't immediately win the 14, but we did win indexation, which was a demand of the campaign. And I'll tell you something, in Ontario, the vast majority of collective agreements don't have cost of living adjustments in their collective agreements. Most unions have gave those up in the 1990s. This is a restoration of cost of living adjustments each and every year for the working class as a whole. We won that. And in Ontario, the minimum wage was frozen for 12 of the 20 years between 1995 and 2015. So this is a very important win that we were able to secure, and important for the working class. And I'll just end by saying that what was so interesting about the first campaign, when we got from 10.25 to 11, obviously not 14, we got indexation and we got the commitment to review all the labor laws. But around that same time that we launched 14 now was when the Fight for 15 in the United States launched. And when they won their first victory, SeaTac workers at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, that was a movement that was based on the unions at the airport actually fragmenting to the point where they more or less had lost their unions and reconstituting themselves as a working class movement based on newcomer and immigrant workers, where their connections with Muslim workers in the neighborhood and so forth actually helped to build a working class movement that helped them win $15 minimum wage, paid sick days, measures to curb the growth of part-time work, and more. And that victory helped to create a sense of possibilities amongst workers in Ontario. So whereas one point people thought only 14 was possible, when they saw that U.S. workers, fast food workers, vulnerable workers just like themselves could win 15, people said, hell, if they can do it there, we can do it here. And that allowed us to launch the Fight for 15 and Fairness. It allowed us to take the fight for the minimum wage through the Changing Workplaces Review and make this a conversation in every community in the province. And like the sisters and brothers before us, we were told, no, it's not possible. $14 was ridiculous. It's highfalutin. It's out of scope, said the Liberals. It's tactically a mistake, said some of the union leaders. And we said, absolutely not. This is what motivates the workers to fight for their own. And we did it, and that's why $15 is actually on the table. A year ago, the government basically flipped and said, we are going to put 14 on the table now, $15 in a year. It's the fastest phase-in and so to date across the United States. This is what we need to fight for. It's a united working class movement that puts anti-oppression in the heart of it, that sees workers themselves as the agents of change. This is what we need to keep fighting for. And I'll end by saying, we need your help. We need all of you to take these posters, put them up, because when a worker in precarious workers employment sees a sign like this, they see it as a gesture of solidarity. It builds their confidence to keep fighting, because when Tim Hortons comes out and cuts workers' hours and makes them pay the brunt of the wage increase, it's a way of trying to discipline the working class and make them feel like it's a mistake to dream for more. But when we stand up together and say no, when we put these on our walls and our windows and our doors, it also sends a message to workers. It sends a message to politicians to say that we expect nothing short of 15 and decent work. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, we've called a demonstration June 16th. It's about a little over a week after the June 7th election. The Ontario Federation of Labour has agreed to co-sponsor it. We need to make this a priority, no matter who wins, and by the way, I'm very confident that we can defeat Doug Ford if we get out there and tell people about what's at stake, and that we don't lead on ridiculing his lack of knowledge or shaming him about his looks or whatever. But if we talk to workers about the issues, I have absolutely no doubt that we can turn this around. But it means a race against the clock. We have no time to lose whatsoever. And if we can't pull it off by June 7th, I'm certain that we can pull it off afterward, but it means June 16th is very important no matter who wins, whether it's Doug Ford, heck, if it's the NDP, If we think that there is a backlash against the Liberals for doing a good thing for workers, you can only begin to imagine what kind of hell will rain down on the NDP if they take our decent work agenda further, as they promised to do. So we need to be out there in force on 1 o'clock, Ministry of Labour, June 16th. Thank you very much, sisters and brothers.
Those were some great presentations, and I feel very honored to be on a panel with such great speakers. Actually, I'm a little bit intimidated right now. Very good, very good. But my talk is gonna focus a little bit more on the work of Socialist Action, and maybe I'll just hold this. In the political work that we do in the labor movement in Ontario and in Canada. So first of all, my name is Julius Arscott, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a member of Socialist Action, and I'm also an Executive Board Member in the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. We have around 130,000 members across the province, and I was elected a year ago on a socialist platform, and I'll go into details in that in a little bit. Thank you. But first, I've kind of taken a few notes here, but I guess I'll start with some of the more positive things that have happened in the last little while. In particular, well, for instance, right now, QP 3903, the York University's folks are on strike right now. They have been going on for quite some time, but they are adamant that they are going to fight against any of the concessions that the employer is trying to force on them. Their previous round of bargaining that came out of that strike with very significant increases and a lot of public support. In fact, it may have, well, I don't know if it's connected to the academic strikes that we're seeing in the United States and even more recently in Ontario, but it might have been. It might have been a precursor to the kind of militancy that we're seeing today. It went as far as the workers in the local actually winning back all of their strike pay, or the pay that they lost while they were on strike. So those workers didn't lose a dime when they were on strike. That's how strong their resolve was and how much support they had from the public in that round. And this round is, they have a lot of support from the labor movement. It's not, I don't think it's quite to the same extent, but it's all about tactics and whatever the local kind of tactics you're using at the time. And I think they have done a bang-up job, and they're certainly on the more militant level of activism within the Toronto region. So we all need to participate and be part of supporting them in their struggle, and we hope that they get a good deal and this comes to a close soon. And just to continue on, the OPSEU, the college academic workers, were recently on strike. And just go into a bit of a background, because I've been active in my union for about 8 years, and so my union is broken down into different divisions, and I'm going to be quite frank here. I'm amongst comrades, but there's a very strong top-down approach in my union, along with many other unions, and some unions are worse and some are better. But within my union, the college academic division really bucked the trend in terms of demanding that they negotiate their own contract. This didn't happen in other divisions, and I'll go into that. But these folks decided that they were going to follow the process of collective bargaining. They were going to elect a bargaining team, go through the process, go through negotiations, and they brought a strike vote to the membership, in which it passed in the, I think in the 60 percentile range, something like that. So they went out, they couldn't resolve, they went out on strike, not feeling, 100%, but feeling like that they needed to go on strike. And they built a campaign around the issues. The media, corporate media, of course, attacked them relentlessly, attacked them for taking the students' year away, all that stuff, all that typical anti-union, anti-labor stuff. And but the activists in that division did such a good job at presenting their ideas, focusing on what was important, such as academic freedom, and really increasing the learning experience for the students, that they garnered a huge amount of support They were on strike for 5 weeks, and the employer basically forced a vote on them. They got a 90% participation rate after 5 weeks of being out on strike. And the deal that was offered to them, that was basically they were being forced to try to accept, was rejected by like over 80%. So this was totally unprecedented, and nobody would have guessed it. You know, the leadership of the union was kind of, they denigrated the thing going, you know, in discussions in the background. They didn't think it could be done. They thought it was a waste of time. But time and time again, it shows you that when you have rank and file members who are willing to fight, and when given the opportunity, that they can win. And they came out of that strike, even though they were eventually forced back to work by scab legislation of Kathleen Wynne Liberals. They came out of that an arbitration ruling which gave them academic freedom, which is it's a form of workplace democracy. I mean, imagine that. Not full blown, obviously, but a significant change in the language and setting a trend, I think, for the education sector potentially going forward. They won seniority rights, but they also won, which is very important, is that they mobilized the membership in that division in a way that was totally unprecedented in the union and really set an example for workers and the rest of OPSEU, in my opinion. Something that should have been far more highlighted, in which I made my own attempt, and I'll talk about that soon. A couple other things, the OFL and NDP support, there was a historic vote, actually two historic votes, two votes that came to the same conclusion at the recent OFL convention, where the idea of the OFL making a recommendation for a vote for the NDP, our Labour Party, passed by delegates at the OFL convention. You might, for those of you out of town or those of you who may just not be in the know, this was actually a big fight. The OFL hadn't made a recommendation of its affiliates to vote for the NDP since Bob Rae days, prior to Bob Rae, I should say. At least that's what I understand. So there was a big fight on the floor. The leadership of much of the leadership of the labor movement still depends on or relies on strategic voting, which we know means voting Liberal. And so this was a rejection of that, and that was actually a very big victory. Chris Buckley, the president of the OFL, still had to be pushed, and recently he actually put out an article in Metro making it very clear that this is the stance of the OFL after, I think, a miscommunication several weeks ago on television. Of course, the 15 Fairness campaign has been a huge success, and all the activists, Pam, you, and others deserve all the credit for all the hard work that you've put in and really changing the material environment for workers in this province. And we really do have to defend all the gains won by that. And also there have been some small steps in getting labor involved with fighting the alt-right well, I can speak only for Toronto, but through the Toronto York Region Labour Council, there has been some small efforts in regards to getting labor activists out to support these counter demonstrations that have been taking place, for instance, at City Hall and at other locations where the different alt-right groups are getting together and harassing, Muslims or just, anti-immigrant bullshit. So that's been good. But I want to go into some of the more significant negative things that I think that we need to focus on and challenge. While there have been many, some significant gains, there have been some losses, and one of the most significant ones that has happened has been Unifor's withdrawal from the Canadian Labour Congress. And this happened some months ago. For those of you who don't know, Unifor is an amalgamation of the CEP and the CAW, which happened a few years ago. They participated in the last CLC convention, and then all of a sudden there was sort of an announcement that they were withdrawing from the CLC. And this was a great shock to many people. Unifor has many activists across the country who play key roles in the labor movement, what we refer to as the House of Labor. And of course, significantly, this decision was made undemocratically. There was no motion or anything brought to the membership to say, we have an issue with the